Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak in opposition to this draconian, reactionary legislation. In 2016, Marianka Human, a young German backpacker working on a Perth building site, fell into an open lift shaft. Marianka plunged 13 stories to her death. We cannot imagine the horror of the final seconds that she would have experienced. She was only 27, a promising life cut short, a visit to Australia from which she never returned to her native land. The CFMEU received photos from the site that appeared to show safety contraventions. 2 CFMEU organisers arrived at the site with right of entry permits. Why were they there? They were there to carry out what is a prime duty of trade union officials, to ensure the safety of workers, to ensure that workers who leave home in the morning get to go home to their family, friends and local community at night. The fact is that Marianka was tragically let down. She was never going home. Those CFMEU organisers wanted to know why, and they wanted to make sure that it never happened to any of Marianka's colleagues. This company, of course, was run by Jerry Hansen, the owner of the construction company. Jerry Hansen, of course, is a Liberal Party member. He's a Liberal Party donor. How does he react to this response to a pointless waste of such a young life cut short? How does he respond to this move by a union to come in and to inspect the site to ensure that it doesn't happen again? You would think that he would make every effort to ensure that another person in his care, which he has a duty for as the owner of this company, that it never happened again. You would think he would welcome every possible inspection to ensure that safety was there on the site, that those who worked for him to gain profits for him got to go home at the end of the day. Oh no. He responded by excluding the union from the building site, excluding the union, illegally excluding the union from the site. Speaking with the Australian newspaper, he described himself as this: a Liberal at heart. A young woman in his employ was dead, and his response was to bar the CFMEU organisers from entering and doing exactly what the law allowed them to do. A young woman was dead, and Hansen wanted to block the union from investigating. A young woman was dead, and Hansen said he was unrepentant about blocking the union from doing the very job that the law, the magical thing that those opposites say they want to uphold, the very job that the law sanctions the union to carry out. A young woman was dead, and Hansen said the enemy was the union. Federal Circuit Court Judge Sandy Street described Hansen, and I quote from the legal judgment, quote, blinded by his hatred, end quote, of the CFMEU. Now, where might he have got that hatred from? It's the sort of rhetoric that we hear from the dispatch box every question time in this House. It's the sort of rhetoric that we hear from those who are supposed to represent the national interests when it comes to workplace relations rather than sectional interests. The sort of rhetoric that we hear for partisan political purposes perpetrated by those opposite day after day. Here we have a legitimate role of a union, a legitimate role of a company too. I've made it very clear for my entire time in this place that Labor at our best understands that there are common interests between workers and employers, that you can't actually have trade union members unless you have a private sector that's employing those trade union members, that we have common interests in boosting productivity, that we have common interests in ensuring that workers can contribute in their workplaces, that businesses which are most successful are ones that have the harmony and the enthusiasm of their workforce. Profits aren't created in abstract, certainly not profits in companies that employ people. There's some speculative operations, so enamoured by those opposite who think everyone engages in that sort of activity. But the truth is that businesses that employ people rely upon those people, and smart employers, the employers who I've got to know over the years, you know, the Lindsay Foxes of this world, understand exactly that, understand that they want not just workers who work for them for a wage, workers who are proud to work for them, that safety is critical. And yet what do we have with this legislation before us today? What do we have with the rhetoric from those opposite with this legislation? They ignore the Jerry Hansons. We know that he was fined some $62,000. $62,000 for excluding the union from the worksite. What we know, though, is that this young woman, Marianka Human, won't be coming back. Won't be coming back. Those opposite, when they talk about industrial relations, are so unbalanced in their approach. This is a government that's just won its third term in office. A third term in office in which they come to this place with wages stagnating. A third term in office in which we have examples including wage theft of $8 million plus in one circumstance of one very prominent member of the community, Mr Columbaris. Circumstances in which penalty rates were cut on July 1, just before, yet again, just before this parliament resumed its sitting. Circumstances in which we know that the circumstances of Marianka are not unique, that there are fatalities and serious injuries on too many work sites right across the country, and that some of those, not all, but some of those are absolutely preventable. What we have from those opposite, though, is just an anti-union obsession. They're not concerned about the impact of the current industrial relations system on the economy, the fact that enterprise bargaining isn't working in a fair way. And when I met with the Business Council of Australia, they said that. It's not just the ACTU, it's both sides. It's the Reserve Bank of Australia who say that. It's every economist who says that. What's their solution to the problem with the economy of stagnant wages? Get rid of the trade union movement. What will that result in, do you think? Wages going up or wages going down? We know that the most successful economies in the world are ones that understand that trade unions have a critical role to play in our democracy, a vital role, the right to organise labour. And those opposite say that there's some contradiction in our position and in the position I've taken with regard to Mr John Setka. One of the first things I did as the leader of the Labor Party is advocate for his suspension from the party that remains in place. I've said this man does not have values that are consistent with the values of the Australian Labor Party, and the recent court conviction confirms that. There is no contradiction between my saying that he should no longer be a member of a party that I lead, and the fact that I respect the right of trade unions to determine democratically who leads them. That's not the job of parliamentarians. That's the job of the unions democratically. And that is a fundamental principle of democratic engagement. If you look at totalitarian regimes, one of the things that defines them is attacks on the rights of organised labour to have their own independent organisation. So yes, the Labor Party has connections going back proudly with the trade union movement to 1891. But we are separate entities, and I have always regarded that as an important principle for the Labor Party, but also an important principle for the trade union movement. Their right to act independently of us. We are not one organisation. We are a political party that has to represent more than just trade union members. We have to represent independent contractors. We have to represent people's interests who aren't members of unions. We have to represent small business. We have to represent people who are looking for work but unable to get it. Hence why we are arguing the case for New Start recipients. We're a broad party, but what we won't do is stand back and support bad legislation which is aimed at yet again providing an argument rather than a solution. This government is obsessed by trying to provide wedges to the Australian Labor Party. They're not governing in the national interest. They don't have an agenda for its third term. The average trade unionist is not a CFMEU member. The average trade unionist in 2019 is female, is in their mid-40s, and is likely to be a nurse or a childcare worker. That's the face of the modern trade union movement. And what this legislation does, though, is provide for penalties against unions that aren't there for employer organisations. No one here in the government is arguing that Mr Columbaris should be barred from ever having a business or indeed continuing in his business. So you've got to be consistent. And we on this side will be consistent. And from time to time, people might have noticed that Mr Setka hasn't responded warmly to my actions. From time to time, I've got the guts to make decisions that are in the interests of the nation. Those opposite don't. They represent sectional interests. They're not prepared to call out bad behaviour by employers. They don't ever do it. They stand up, they defend their sectional interests, they defend, in this case, their donors and their advocates in the Liberal Party. And that is why this legislation should be rejected. They should go back to the drawing board. We're prepared to discuss legislation that genuinely advances the needs of employees and employers. I don't want unions behaving badly, but I don't want employers behaving badly either. What this does is attempt to provide political power and take away the rights of workers, by and large who most people affected by this legislation are volunteers. They're people who give up their own time to sit in committee of management meetings or executive meetings of trade unions. They do it because they care about their fellow workers. It costs them money to do it usually. It costs them money, let alone time. But those committed working people who have the best concept, if they don't understand the concept of solidarity, those opposite, maybe they should understand the concept of mateship, because they talk about it occasionally. So in terms of this legislation, it should be rejected. It's a substitute for real action from the government, a government like a chook with no head, frantically doing a few laps of the yard, running around, there's lots of noise, but no real action.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition.